Good evening and welcome to a special All About Women Q&A in collaboration with the Sydney Opera House. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions tonight. American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Mei Fong. Warami, lawyer, businesswoman and former advisor to the PM on Indigenous family violence, Josephine Cash. Icelandic author Thordis Elva, who's touring Australia with the man who raped her 20 years ago to discuss sexual violence and forgiveness. Seattle-based writer and performer Lindy West. And fresh from hosting the weekend's Mardi Gras broadcast, actor and presenter Faustina Agoli. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. It's live everywhere else on News 24 at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Time. And you can watch and listen live on iView, Facebook, ABC News Radio and on Periscope through Twitter. Our first question tonight comes from Zoe Bolkowski.
The organisers of the recent Women's March have introduced a new campaign, A Day Without Women, which calls for women to strike, not participating in paid or unpaid work or shopping, in order to make a statement on how women are undervalued in the workforce. How effective do you think this protest will be?
Lindy, I'll start with you. How effective do you think a women's strike would be?
I mean, obviously it would be tremendously effective if we could mobilise every single woman in the world. I think a concern for me as a very privileged, financially stable white woman who works from home and doesn't really even go to work. If I make my own schedule. I'm an author, so my schedule is very loose.
You could just stop cleaning your teeth.
Right, exactly. It's which I might do anyway, just for no political reason. But no, it's very easy for me to say yes, everyone should go on strike. But I want to be very cognizant of the fact that there are many, many women who cannot afford to lose one day's worth of pay, let alone risk their job. But that said, there's definitely an element that's been lost from protest, especially in the States. People don't really understand that protest is most effective when it disrupts people's lives. And so there's this constant back and forth, can't we just sort of march nicely through the streets where we're told? And a lot of people, especially white people, get very upset when, the freeway is blocked or the airport is shut down or these things that actually disrupt people's lives. But it is important to remember that that's what gets results.
Faustina, what do you think?
Oh, I think it is slightly problematic because the first thing I thought about were the women that couldn't afford to strike. But another element of this particular campaign is for women to wear red on that day. Those who can't work express... Oh, there we go, May. She's rocking the red. Yeah, I was initially resistant to the idea when I first saw it on an Instagram post. But
how do you think it would work in an all-women same-sex household?
How would it work in an all-women same-sex household? I think we'd have a riot. It'd be great. And I think that this idea has also been modelled from different countries having different strikes over the course of history. They gave the example of the 1908. I think it was in Manhattan where garment workers striked. And I think, in a nationalistic sense, if it was specific to a certain industry, like the nurses in Australia, that makes a lot of sense and is very effective. But I question whether or not it could happen globally.
Thordis, what do you think?
Well, in 1975, we had a women's strike in Iceland that garnered world attention because 90% of Icelandic women stopped working that day and walked out of their jobs and left everything. And it completely paralyzed our society. There were traffic blocks, just like you're explaining. No company worked that day. So everything basically shut down. And
did anything change?
Yes, it did. But to me, it underlined that nothing works if women don't work and if their contribution is not valued. But yes, it was very highly effective. It led to not only political but social changes and the formation of a women's equality party that then underpinned the election of the first female head of state, the democratically elected female president in the world on the very same night that I was born. So all of this serves to underline that, yes, I think that they can work mass demonstrations.
Josephine, what do you think? A woman head of state could arise out of something like this, but would it be Pauline Hanson?
Well, not the way it's framed. And unfortunately, I think it's a great a great idea, but unfortunately I think it's the whole premise behind this is quite motherhood statements against neoliberalism, and it would be great to see first world women align to support people in third world countries, like stopping sex slavery. That would be great. And I think that's something we can all get behind, instead of these sort of the socialists and the capitalists, and, you know, it seemed to sort of have one ideology, which I think we really as women need to pick our battles, not be so broad, and actually bring all women together, whatever occupation they have, whether they, you know, work in the corporate world or not. And probably one of the most effective strategies would be to stop supporting companies that within their supply chain they may have, you know, abuses of, you know, international work against women and not equal pay, but particularly in the third world. I think first world women forget, for example, that there are some Australians actually living in third world conditions, and they're Aboriginal women.
Yeah.
They're Aboriginal women who don't actually, in very remote communities, don't have access to housing. The worst affected areas, there's 19 adults and children per room. Why don't people with privilege start looking at, and women especially, start actually looking at the people who've got the most need?
Mei Fong, what do you think? And would anything like this ever happen in China, for example, a far more restrictive society?
Well, in China a few years ago, there were feminists who tried to organize a small protest against sexual harassment. So, you know, who can argue with that? You know, who wants to be sexually harassed? What happened was these feminists were put in prison. So, no, it's really
The central
hard.
government tends not to like any form of demonstration.
Any form of demonstration. So I think having the power to protest is something that is so powerful that you guys who have it don't realize what a great privilege it is. And I now live in Washington, D.C., which is the heart of crazy Trump land now. And every weekend now, I see protests. Every Sunday, it's protests against the immigration ban, it's protests against treatment of women, and I like, bless my heart. This is so wonderful. What I see, people, children holding up signs in the streets. And in China, they would be carted away. You guys don't realize how wonderful it is to be able to get out there and not be tear gassed.
Well, in part, you've anticipated our next question. I'll go straight to it. It's from Abby Donaldson.
Thank you. President Trump's so-called misogyny is being disproved by his new bills, which are helping encourage women to take jobs in science, technology, engineering and mathematic fields. Does this delegitimise the constant rhetoric that came from the feminist movement during the campaign, labelling him as a misogynist?
Lindy West.
It's not up for debate whether or not he's a misogynist. He's a confessed sexual assault fan. he is openly admitted. He's openly admitted to grabbing women by their genitalia. You're making a confused face, but this is on tape. We've all heard this a million times. Many women have come forth to say that he sexually harassed or sexually assaulted them. So, I mean,
Does it confuse you at all when Trump turns around, and he did sign 2 bills in recent days, surrounded by women, his wife, his daughter amongst them, aimed at recruiting women into STEM areas?
I wish he would sign bills surrounded by women that have to do with women's reproductive health care and abortion. It's very easy.
He did sign another bill, as you know, in January, cutting off American aid.
I know. You know, I haven't read this STEM bill. I don't know what it says, but I feel fairly comfortable saying, without even having read it, that that's a PR move. And Donald Trump does not care about women having careers in STEM fields, but he knows that he has to maintain some semblance of caring about women and women's careers. But as a person who lives in his country and is soon to feel the effects of his policies and his ethos, no, I have zero confidence in him proving us wrong.
All right, let's throw across to May, because you do live in Washington, D.C. Does he confuse you? Does he go one way and then the other?
I think well, you know, if he's so supportive of STEM and research, why is he against climate change? Why has he elected a Secretary of Energy who basically dislikes the whole entire field? We have gone from you know, having previous Secretaries of Energy who were Nobel Prize winners and, you know, who actually have gone to school and PhDs and studied the field, to this. I don't, you know, this is, to me, lip service, you know.
Yeah, Thordis, what do you think?
I completely agree with both May and with Lindy. This is not an act that shows to me that he truly is behind women's rights. And as a matter of fact, everything he's done so far has proved the opposite to me, especially the gag order, which had a tremendous effect on the sexual and reproductive health services.
Well, we should explain what that is. The gag order, we were just talking about it a moment ago, but that was the refusal to allow any US aid money to go to any organisation in the world which deals with reproductive health, particularly that allows or advises on abortion.
Exactly. And this could have tremendous effect, especially on women in vulnerable communities. So if those are his priorities, that he's willing to sign a fancy bill for women that have an education and are in high positions and could elevate their careers, but at the same time doesn't give more of a concern for the very basic rights of women and children around the world, then I agree, that's lip service.
Josephine? The questioner was making the point that the idea that Trump is a misogynist was somehow disproven by these two bills, in which he did genuinely sign these two bills, which were, although he didn't put a lot of money behind them, but two major government agencies are going to have to employ more women in areas around STEM.
Well, obviously, you know, he said some very sexist comments and has a track record of that, but at the end of the day, the American people voted him in, and unfortunately it's great to see that people are rallying against him. But people, unlike this country, there's a large majority that identify with him, and I think if we were to take all sexist people, or people who have sexist views, who are in power, or people who are racist, who would we have left? I mean...
It's probably not a large majority of the American population, since he didn't win the overall vote.
And
but,
we don't have compulsory voting, so many millions of people didn't vote.
But it's certainly a large number of people, and enough for him to win a pretty convincing electoral victory.
The one good thing is he's quite... I think some people resonate with him but he says his views. And it's people like yourselves who can challenge those. It is a good thing he's supporting women in STEM.
Yeah. Does he?
Oh gosh, it just everything about Trump is worrying for me. I mean, I've spent a significant amount of time in the States, and being a woman of colour, I now feel very much like a moving target. And I mean, I just don't believe it. I think it's very tokenistic, particularly when, you know, you hear stories of well, there's literally, he's on tape talking about grabbing women by the genitalia, and then only today I noticed that John Cheadle had tweeted that his father was on a golf course and he had mentioned to his golf buddies, or he asked one of his golf buddies if he'd ever, I don't even know if I can say the N-word, but if he'd ever slept with an N-word before. It's just an absolute disgrace.
Now, you were in the States during some critical periods. What were you doing there? And did you get a sense the country is deeply split, divided over the issues that Trump raises?
I've been over in the States looking to expand my work in the arts. I'm acting now, and I'm working with the SDC this year, so I probably won't be spending much time in the US. But I was there during the Orlando massacre. I was there when I was getting ready for LA Pride. I was painting Pride T-shirts. Overnight, I only found out about the Orlando massacre when I arrived to the parade site and found out the news. And that's when I found out that a lot of friends didn't want to join. While we were parading, every time a balloon popped, everybody was startled. And then later we found out, the LA Times reported that a man had been seized with an arsenal of weapons who was going to shoot up LA Pride that day. And that was my cue to leave. But I mean, and that was during the end of the Obama administration, where the Trumpian talk started to happen in the atmosphere. And it was a frightening time to be there. I had legitimate paranoia stepping into gay clubs and specifically black gay clubs in DC, for example, wondering whether or not it was going to, blow up that night.
Yeah, and they have guns.
And they have guns. And I think if somebody incites violence and incites people to judge each other by the colour of their skin or their sexuality. That's a very scary thing.
That's right. I mean, there's just been a recent spate of cases of people...
We're not saying that Trump is doing that precisely.
No, he's winking at it. He's not coming out and condemning it. You know, there's been a recent spate of cases where Indian people from India in the States have been shot at least 3 cases that I can think of so far, with somebody saying, go back to your own country. Now, the White House has not come out and said anything about that. You know, they have not strongly condemned it. They have denied all culpability, and I frankly think that that's a disgrace.
OK, let's move on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Our next question comes from... We're going to try and get through as many questions as we can. The next question comes from Karen Van Eden.
My question is for Thordis Elva. You and Tom Stranger have both spoken about this long process of forgiveness that you've both gone through to find some element of peace. A big part of that would have been the way in which Tom was open to that dialogue and open to your contact after that long separation. My question is, in instances where the perpetrator of the assault is not open to that dialogue, not remorseful, or perhaps still in denial about their actions, how can the victim obtain some level of forgiveness or closure?
Thordis.
That is an excellent question. Thank you so much. I would like to say that forgiveness is not dependent on the perpetrator's remorse, because if it were so, then it would mean that the release that comes with forgiveness, when you're able to let go of anger and hatred and negative emotions and bitterness that may be corroding you, would only be open to those who had perpetrators that would show remorse. I don't like to believe in that world. I think that there is a world where you can let go of all of those emotions and find reconciliation and peace without that being in any way dependent on the perpetrator. So that's what I would like to maintain. In my case, I have to admit that the remorse was an acknowledgement that had healing qualities for me.
I think perhaps for those in the audience who don't know the story, could you just briefly spell out what happened? How did you get raped?
Right. Well, I was a 16-year-old girl in love for the first time, living in Iceland, and my first boyfriend was this handsome Australian exchange student that charmed me with his accent and his worldly ways. And a month after we started dating, there was a Christmas dance at our school. And I was drunk on my newfound maturity, feeling that I was all grown up now, that I had a boyfriend to take me to the dance. So I decided to take yet another stride into adulthood and try rum for the first time. And that was a very bad idea. And I became very ill. And I spent that night drifting in and out of consciousness in the bathrooms, vomiting convulsively. And Tom, my boyfriend, then rescued me from this situation, and I was completely incapacitated. I could not move a limb or utter a word, and he took me home and ignored the advice of some security guards that thought that I might perhaps need an ambulance. That's how serious it seemed. But we got home, and I remember the feelings of gratitude that I felt and this frustration at not being able to utter a word of thanks. But that all turned into horror and betrayal when he undressed me and decided to have his way with me. And the way I was positioned on my bed meant that my line of vision, there was my alarm clock. And in order to survive and just stay sane throughout the pain, was to count seconds for me. So that's what I did while this was happening. And I got up to 7,200, so it was a long ordeal. And it left me very shattered.
Clearly, and everyone out there will be saying, how could you forgive someone who did that to you?
Well, I think first I have to talk about the fact that I did not see it for what it was at first. I was a 16-year-old kid with a head full of misconceptions and what I'd like to call the monster myth. So I did not put 2 and 2 together and realize that what I'd been through was actually rape. It took me a long time to debunk these myths. And once I had done so, not only had Tom, my perpetrator, moved to the other side of the planet effectively, all my physical injuries had healed, and I had obviously no witnesses. At the time in Iceland, 70% of rape cases were dismissed. even when all of that evidence was there that I didn't have. So taking that course of option just didn't ever seem realistic for me. So I did what very many people do. I tried to just carry on with my life. I tried to numb my emotions. I tried to overcompensate. I became a very effective overachiever. And this worked for about 9 years. And that's when I was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. And that's when I thought, okay, I'm going to have to find my voice to address what had happened to me. So I decided to write a letter to my perpetrator. And I did not expect anything. I just needed to state my case. I needed to make him aware of the damage that he had done to me. And I thought that he might respond in whatever negative way or just simply ignore it. But the only thing that I didn't prepare for was what then happened, that he actually responded with a written confession. And it was quite disarming in its candor. And it bred the wild hope in me that maybe I would get the answer to this million-dollar question that I think is every survivor's main question, and it's why? Why did you do this? And so it sparked a correspondence that stretched over 8 years. So forgiveness was definitely not something that came fast, and it was definitely not something that came without a lot of searing honesty and conversations that literally leave you feeling skinned. But I also have to be clear that forgiveness was never, ever for him. I think it's an extremely misunderstood concept. People somehow think that you're giving the perpetrator something when you forgive. But in my view, it's the complete polar opposite. Forgiving was for me so that I could let go of the self-blame and shame that I'd wrongfully shouldered that were corroding me and basically ruining my life.
We'll come to the fact that you've actually now written a book together with Tom, that you are basically going around the world together talking about this in quite a confronting way. We'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to hear from Josephine. You deal a lot or have dealt a lot with the victims of sexual violence. Is forgiveness a possibility in your view?
Of course, but I don't know much about Icelandic law, and it's brave to say stuff, but I would advise against anybody in Australia going down this course for public policy reasons, because the courts are the best place, and the police, if someone rapes you, the best place to go is the police. Many women have spent decades in this country trying to let women know, police and community members, that it's not their fault they got raped. That if you forgive the offender, this is the problem. About 2 years ago, there was a case in Perth where a young Aboriginal woman was beaten so hard that she lost her baby, miscarried. She told the police, and then she thought, he's got good attributes. I was in love with him once, and she met back with him. Wasn't a couple of months later, she was hit 200 times, 50 times in the genital region. And that's, you see a lot of women, and I'm talking from a prosecutor, who have forgiven. It's a perpetual cycle in domestic violence. The best place is for the offender is to go to court, because in our system, criminal system, we have a way of monitoring them. We have a sex offenders register, and the court, after someone's found guilty, has to make an assessment as to whether they're low, medium or high risk of reoffending. If they're a child sex offender, there is legislation where they can be indefinitely detained. Now, I can tell you right now, if this happened in Australia and this person was convicted, right now they would not be able to benefit from a global world tour or from a book, because we have proceeds of crime legislation that prevents criminals from profiting, and it doesn't matter whether it's a first offence.
I'm just going to interrupt you because we've got a question that deals with this, and we'll come back to this and hear from again from Tortoise and the rest of the panel. But the question is from Yusra Metwali.
Sexual assault is a serious offence punishable by up to 14 years in jail in New South Wales and 16 years in Iceland. Why should a perpetrator of sexual assault be praised for the mere acknowledgement of wrongdoing without being held accountable at law for his crime? Why should a rapist essentially profit from his crime? Will Tom Stranger donate 100% of its proceeds to survivors of sexual assault?
I know you wanted an opportunity to attack some of the
Thank you for that question. I need to give just a little bit of background that in 2009, I wrote another book, and it was on the criminal justice system and how it deals with sexual violence. And in that book, I made a case that we're too lenient in sexual violence cases. Very few cases actually get through that eye of the needle that it takes with all the burden of proof and the difficult circumstances that you have to fulfill. But yeah, we're also paying too little in damages, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. So I suggested a range of reforms. And after that, I was appointed to government committees. I oversaw the National Action Plan Against Violence Against Women in Iceland, et cetera. So I have a very strong view in favor of the criminal justice system. But you're right, Josephine, it's different in Iceland, and the statute of limitations had passed by the time that any confrontational work took place between me and my perpetrator. So unfortunately, even if both of us felt that the only right thing in this situation would be for him to spend time behind bars, even if he were to walk into a police station and say, I want to confess, they would have said, we're sorry, we can't do anything for you. So I am one of the millions of people whose case fell through the cracks of the legal system, as much as I would want to have belonged to that course of action. But then I also want to say that very many people don't feel safe within the legal system and don't see justice fulfilled within it. Last time I checked, 98% of women that are raped never see their offender spend any time behind bars. It's the most underreported crime in the world. So that also speaks volumes of women not feeling that if they go and try to get justice served, that they will be received well, that they will be believed, that they even have a case in their hands.
Tortoise, you understand how many people have been found it very confronting to see you on stage with the guy who's confessed to raping you.
I understand.
And there's a whole sort of line of inquiry out there. People looked at the TED talk that you did together and said, I can't stand it, that people are applauding someone who's done a rape, applauding comments by someone who has raped somebody. Now, how do you respond to that, first of all, and then I'll hear from the other panellists?
Well, it's not about applauding a rapist. It's about a rapist giving voice to the immeasurable hurt that he caused. And in my view, that is an antidote to some of the normalization that we're seeing today in this discourse. When we're seeing the most powerful man in the Western world say that sexually assaulting women is a part of men's culture and locker room talk, and brush it off like that, like it doesn't hurt and that you don't have to take responsibility for it. We're trying to flip that narrative and say that is wrong and responsibility needs to be taken even when the legal system can't cater to it. It's also been wrongly classified as a women's issue. Sexual violence is not a women's issue. But it's also
You mean it's not entirely a women's issue?
Right. Well, the public discourse about sexual violence has been the results of women's emotional labor. Women have been slaving to get this to be talked about, for this agenda to be pushed. And I think it's high time that the people responsible, which in an overwhelming majority of cases are men, when it comes to violence against women, that they don't get a free pass, that they contribute to finding a solution to this incredibly socially pervasive problem. Okay. And I don't think we can afford to not collaborate.
Josephine, I know, wants to jump back in, but I do want to hear quickly from the other panellists first, and I'll come back to you. Lindy, what do you think?
Oh, I'm genuinely curious about, is he donating the money?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to skip over that question. As the primary author of South of Forgiveness, I'm getting the overwhelming majority of all royalties. Tom gets a small portion, and he's looking into what charities he can invest his profits in at the moment.
OK, so back to Lindy. So your reaction to the general argument about forgiveness, and then I'll hear from the other panellists.
Yeah,
Try and keep it brief, because we've got a lot of questions.
Of course. I do think it reads much differently if he ends up profiting from it. And we talked about this backstage. I think what would be really constructive for him to do if he does want to be a man speaking out about sexual violence is to spend his time talking to other men, talking to young men. I think, like you said, this is coded as a women's issue, and it's overwhelmingly women who are, who I see talking about your story. And I think that the people that really need to hear it are young men who've been raised in a rape culture and who've been raised to have really permissive attitudes and really entitled, appropriative attitudes about women's bodies.
And that is what he says. He says, I felt entitled and I felt like I had a right to her body that night because I was her boyfriend. And I think, unfortunately, that these are not attitudes that are bred in a vacuum. This is something we need to bring out into the daylight and talk about, no matter how ugly it is to hear it.
Okay, I need to hear from the
so
other
prevalent.
panellists, though, Thordis, and I
Yes.
want to hear from Faustina.
I'm kind of interested in the fact that Thordis and Josephine actually do have a similar aim, which is, this is based on me watching you, Josephine, speak with Marsha Langton yesterday at the Opera House, and you brought up the No More campaign and it being very effective in the Northern Territory, and that was about with men only being able to change if they held themselves accountable, and this is what's happened in your situation. Unfortunately, the courts failed you in your situation because of the amount of time that had lapsed and that you didn't have much physical evidence. And I'd want to throw it over to Josephine to see whether or not she agrees.
I think Josephine has a point about, yes, you do need to go through the court system, but we also need to be aware of the fact that quite often the court system is patriarchal and fails women. I don't know Australian law. I certainly don't know Icelandic law. But in America, very recently, a Stanford graduate raped a woman, and he got away with virtually no jail time because the judge thought he was a fine, upstanding young athlete. And that's not the only case. And what happened in that case was the victim wrote a very long and impassioned piece about it. And I felt that was, again, an interesting way of flipping the script. You do not give other people the power. That's what happens with rape. It's a violation of your rights. When women attempt to sort of flip the script or take back some of the power, I usually tend to applaud that. Of course, I don't, endorse vigilantism. But yes, I like to see, I like to see women take the power back. Yeah.
Now, just before I go to Josephine, please note, if you find any of this discussion disturbing in any way, there are numbers you can call. They're appearing on your screen now. Now then, Josephine, what do you really did want to jump in earlier. I wanted to hear from everyone else, but go ahead.
Well, again, I don't know what happens in Iceland, but in Australia, there are many cases that go through the courts where there's no physical evidence. And I just wanted to make sure that people out there know we wouldn't get any convictions in historical sexual assault if physical evidence was such a major issue. There's no statute of limitations in Australia around reporting these types of crimes. And although our court system is not perfect, it has evolved in a very short period of time around evidence in camera for complainants. Also, police now in New South Wales can take videos of complainants at the time of the scene so they don't have to relive the trauma. The problem that I'm facing with this is that it's not going to work for most people, their rapists contacting them. It's not going to work. And it's great that we've got a panellist here who's risen above. But are we opening the floodgates for rapists to contact victims? Because I know a few of them are really dangerous people. And it's a public policy thing. It's great it's worked here and it's in another country, but in Australia, you should be minded to be protected. Aboriginal women, part of our problem is that because of intergenerational trauma and past policies, Aboriginal women aren't reporting violence. So it's absolutely got out of control in some communities. And pro rata, some communities have some of the worst murder rates in the world, particularly in Central Australia. So it's great someone can do a book tour and living through this, but for the average victim, it won't work for them. But in saying that, there's a lot of bravery there, and I hope that this person will never commit an offence again. But I can't be sure because I'm not a psychologist. He hasn't been brought before a court, and we all know that there's a lot of people in public life who we never thought would commit offences, like Rolf Harris or the Hey Dad people, Hey Dad actor. And look at them. I'm not in that position, and if I was a victim, I would be very hesitant not to have a person brought before a court and get the treatment that they are entitled to. The only way people like this change their behaviour is by being held to account.
OK, Thordis,
Yes.
I'm going to have to ask you to keep it brief, but you do get a right of reply here.
Right. Well, first of all, this is absolutely not prescriptive. We're not putting forth our story in any way, shape, or form as a manual for other people. Secondly, survivors are continually told what they're supposed to do. It's a part of a victim-blaming culture. We're supposed to not wear certain things, not wear short skirts, not drink certain drinks, not be in certain areas, not trust certain people. If we're assaulted, we're supposed to scream louder, fight harder. We're supposed to go straight to the police. We're supposed to press charges and then move on with our lives, having squarely put the blame on the perpetrator's shoulders. Well, that's not often how it actually works in real life. And I think it's a part of something that we have to do is to support survivors, to do whatever feels safe for them, and not tell them that there's a right or a wrong way to react when you're violated. It's something that deeply disturbs you, your ideas about the world, relationships, love, sex, trust. And yeah, I find it very confining to say that all survivors should do one thing when that might not feel safe for everyone. I think that everyone has to find their way and do what feels safe and right for them, because that is their right to heal from what happened.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, obviously a very powerful discussion, but we do have a lot of other things to talk about as well. We've got the next question. It's from Ashley Mills.
Hi, my question is for Lindy tonight. As a person who has hated their body and fought against their body for most of their adolescent life, I commend you for promoting acceptance of your body and the fact that we do not fit into one mould as women. However, given the global obesity epidemic, is it ignorant to assume that overweight is not linked with poor health outcomes? By promoting fat acceptance, is there a risk that you are also promoting obesity and all its risks?
Lindy.
Well, the way that I always address this, and I've said this many, many times, is that you can't take good care of something that you hate. And so allowing people to live in their bodies without shame and without constant apology is the only way to empower people to take care of themselves. And so if that's your priority, if health is your priority, and by the way, it's not a moral imperative for people to be healthy. People don't have to be healthy. People don't owe you health. People own their own bodies and their own lives. But if you do want people to be healthy, which is also a very vague term, very complicated term, but the best thing that you can do for them is fight discrimination against fat people, which includes medical bias. Fat people get measurably worse care from their doctors because of assumptions like that, because of assumptions like you can tell how healthy someone is from looking at them. And so to give fat people the permission to just live their lives and be happy and be vibrant and not think of themselves as a broken temporary thing, as a thin person who's failing every single day, is the best thing that you can do to empower people to go out and live and to take care of this vitally important thing that we live in and that carries us around and carries us through the world. And I also say to people, I have a doctor. I don't need 6 billion doctors around the world telling me what they think is best for me. Like any other human being, I'm entitled to medical privacy. I'm entitled to bodily autonomy. I get to decide what I put in my body. And also we have to remember that the people's body size and body shapes is deeply linked with all kinds of other forces. It's linked with race, it's linked with class, it's linked with people's access to fresh foods, people's access to safe spaces in which to exercise. It's linked to poverty. There are many, many people who, in America, who have to work 3 minimum wage jobs and are still below the poverty line. And those people who are working 18 hours a day are expected to go home and chop up some fresh veggies for their kids and spend an hour cooking. It's just not realistic. And so if we really care about fat people, which is how this is always couched, which is seems very disingenuous to me. If we care about fat people, care about fat people.
Hey, Lindy, there's an extraordinary chapter in your book called "Hello, I'm Fat," and it deals with an amazing confrontation between you and your newspaper editor, Dan Savage, I think it is.
Yes.
Just briefly tell us about that, because in a way it kind of encapsulates the kind of discussion you're having now.
Yeah, so especially, 5-6 years ago when this took place, that sort of question was very popular, very fashionable. We were really in the thick of hating fat people for their own good. And these things that I'm saying were much more controversial than they are today, and they're still pretty controversial. I still get yelled at every day. But at the time, my boss, my editor at the newspaper where I worked, was writing about it a lot, and he's a very funny, sort of snide person, and he was writing in a way that felt really cruel to me, and I felt this sort of strange disconnect that it was like he didn't realize that there was a fat person in his office, and that when he wrote these things about fat people, he was writing them about me. So...
You really let him have it.
I really let him have it. And I let him have it publicly on the blog that we both wrote for. I wrote a very, very long post, and just sort of declaring myself as a fat person and a person who deserves the same dignity and humanity and respect as any other human being. And then there was a big feud in the office, and he was very unhappy, and I narrowly escaped getting fired, probably. But it was incredibly, it was very revealing to me. The response that I got from readers who knew what I looked like and had been noticing that there was a fat person on staff who was not sticking up for them. And the fact that I could use my platform to make people's lives better really changed my life and my career.
Just note for the producers, we're going to go to Barbara Allardyce in a moment. But Faustina, can I go to you just to hear this idea of women kind of reclaiming themselves, which is what Lindy's really talking about here, reclaiming her body, reclaiming herself. In fact, your book is called... It talks about being shrill, so you're reclaiming the idea of being shrill as well, which is kind of interesting. What do you think about this, Faustina, the ability of women in particular to do this?
From a gay perspective?
Oh, actually, I wasn't really thinking that. If that's the way you want to take it, that's fine.
Well,
You've more or less been discovering yourself.
Yes, in many ways. Thank you for prodding me. I love the parallel of Lindy's story of coming out as fat with mine coming out as a gay woman. because in my process of coming out, it's taken me, over 30 years to realise and admit to myself that I'm gay. And yeah, if I'm to draw more parallels, the LGBTQI plus community receives so much homophobia, stigma. It's just rampant, and I think that's what kept me closeted for such a long time. And it took me to run away overseas and to have complete anonymity and be with, accidentally meet women who I found out eventually were gay. And for me to come to the full realisation of who I was, and it was a very vulnerable time for me. And it made me piece together parts of my life that I had kind of shut out for a long, long time, which I think is the story of many queer people generally. And it took them to bolster up my confidence, give me a voice and embolden my life, and to know that I am completely a woman and I deserve to be here and I deserve equal rights.
I wasn't necessarily thinking of that comparison, but it's a brilliant one. And speaking of brilliant, we have a lot of brilliant women on this panel, and I want to hear from each of them separately about what they've got to bring to the table here tonight. So we've got a question from Barbara Allardyce. Let's go to Barbara.
My question is for Mei Fong. Implemented in 1979, China had a one-child policy for many years and has left a whole generation of young men without a chance of marriage or children. Now, young people are encouraged to have a second child, but availability and cost of childcare is prohibitive. How can China hope to solve this?
Mei.
Well, my book basically says they can't for a period of years. that the one-child policy, which has gone on for well over 30-something years, has created a set of problems which won't go away for another 20 or 30 years. Here's the thing, if you spent the last 3+ decades telling people that the one-child family is the ideal, you cannot do a sudden turn around and tell everybody you must have more children now. Some of this relentless propaganda has been sticking. It will stick. And added to that, all these issues to do with the imbalances that the one-child policy has. Too many men, too many old people. You can't turn around and tell women to just go and have babies, get down to it, get busy, you know. And then we're all going to do it, you know. It doesn't work that way. And this is a problem with the one-child policy, that it disproportionately hit women. They were the ones who suffered from it. And unfortunately, now that they seem to be easing up on it, they are still putting the burden on the women, mostly. Most of these ads targeting are trying to shame them, saying, if you hold off on marriage, you are a leftover woman. That's a label that's been put in place.
Because there are so many men who won't find partners.
Yeah, don't hold off, girls. Put it out there, you know. So you're considered a leftover woman starting from the age of 26. Wow, girls, you know, that's it. Game over for you, 26. You know, and that's kind of funny considering that the legal age for marriage in China starts at 20. So you go from, you know, start now to game over in a matter of just 6 years. It's just not, you know, possible.
Mate, can you just go back to the very idea of the one-child policy and the rationale for it in the beginning? Was it actually a rational idea to think of a way of restricting China's population? Because a lot of Western leaders applauded China for this.
Yes.
They thought, oh, well, China's going to do the job for us of stopping the country from the world becoming too overpopulated.
The UN gave gold medals to both China for the one-child policy and India for their forced sterilization when they launched these policies. And this is something the UN should be ashamed of. But the idea was of, you know, anybody who's ever been to China will know, it's a lot of people in China. The first words you particularly learn in Chinese is 人太多, too many people. You take the subway, 人太多. You try to visit the Great Wall, 人太多. But the idea that overpopulation and one-child policy are one and the same, you know, controlling your population planning and one-child policy are one and the same, it's not the same thing at all. What most other countries did was, you know, you give women education, you give them access to contraception and abortion, you have urbanization, that reduces family size very quickly. All these things were happening in China, and China already had in place a plan that encouraged people to have smaller families that was working very well, and it was not as coercive. They didn't need to go DEFCON 1. So when I hear people say, well, you know, the one-child policy is a good thing, we have overpopulation, we have, you know, the world cannot take so many people, this is a good thing. And I ask them, you know, would you like it if you were taking, because if you say the one-child policy, you're also supporting a plan which involves forced sterilization and forced abortions. How would you like it? Somebody comes to your house and takes away your mother or your sister, when she's 7 months pregnant, and takes away. How would you like it if somebody takes you away for sterilization and cuts you up down there, even though you promised to use condoms for the rest of your life and never have a child? Would you like it? Would you take it? And what we tend to forget is we want to save the world. Yes, I believe climate change matters. Yes, it is a big issue. But what are we saving the world for? What is humanity in all this?
I'm actually going to go to Josephine, because when I was thinking about this, the only policy that I could think of in Australia which even somehow mirrored government interference of this nature with children and mothers is the forced removal of children from Indigenous communities. Do you sort of see any, or do you feel some sympathy when you start to hear what May is saying about this policy?
Yeah, and the rates at the moment, as you'd know, Tony, are quite distressing. It seems to have perpetuated itself.
You're saying it's still happening?
Oh, absolutely, but not as an overtly racist policy like it was at that time, but particularly where we see the worst type of statistics for Indigenous Australia is in very remote communities. And these are communities which have very weak labour markets. In the worst affected communities, we've got 19 adults and children per room. I mean, how are you to take your children to school every day, do their homework with them? There's no Bunnings down the road. There's a lot of people don't have washing machines. There's chronic disease. Having 19 adults and children, can you imagine scabies, head lice? So we've got Aboriginal communities who coming up to the 25th anniversary of the Mabo decision, 40% of Australia's landmass is owned in some title by Indigenous people, but those people, particularly in remote, are living in absolute abject poverty.
And can I just bring it back to the notion of this is all about women? What's the impact on Aboriginal women in those communities?
Well, understandably, if someone, if you don't have somewhere to live and you're suffering domestic violence, a lot of women are frightened to call the police because they're worried that they have nowhere to live. If they stay with their partner, they may risk having their children taken off them, but then they also risk being homeless. So it's a really serious situation we have, and I think Australia should be very ashamed.
Tony, can I get a quick interjection or question here? Here's the thing. I've kind of noticed we've had a few questions from the audience now, and they've all been women. And I noticed when we put this panel together, we had a lot of Twitter trolls, some of them saying, it's all about women, where's the inclusion, what about men? And I saw somebody had trolled me and said, okay, will men be allowed in the audience? And I jokingly replied back, yes, via castration.
Now, May, I have
my
to tell
point is, do we have any questions from men?
Well, I did actually offer, before the show started, I spoke to the audience and I said, if there are any men out there brave enough to get involved in this discussion, they should put their hands up. I haven't seen a single hand go up. I might be wrong, but if a hand suddenly shoots up now, I'll definitely take it. Not so much. OK, well, let's move on to another subject that they might like to get involved in. You're watching Q&A live across Australia. Join the discussion on Facebook and Twitter or on Q&A Extra on Facebook and ABC News Radio straight after this program. Our next question comes from Jasmine Naud.
Hi. Whenever news comes to light about yet another revenge porn site, the onus is quickly placed on women for taking or sending sexual photos in the first place. Why is it that as a society we immediately dismiss and minimise the actions of someone who is committing a sex crime like revenge porn and jump immediately to blaming the victim?
I'll start with Thordis because you've actually written about revenge porn in Iceland quite extensively. So we'll go with you and then we'll hear from the other panellists.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Again, we have a pervasive culture of victim blaming where the focus has been on the victim and their behavior as opposed to on the responsibility of the perpetrator. And I so often hear, I've talked to thousands of young people about revenge porn, and I so often hear she just shouldn't have taken that nude photo. That is like the common retort when someone is exposed to this. And in a way, saying that to a victim of revenge porn is like saying to a victim of rape, you shouldn't have worn that short skirt, because it puts the onus on them. And that's where we need to shift the conversation. We need to shift it from the victims, from analyzing what they wore or whom they trusted or what their sexual behavior was, over to the people that are actually perpetrating any kind of sex crime, whether it's online or offline.
I'm quickly going to go down. We've got another question on this. I think we'll go straight to that before I hear from the other panellists. And that question is from Daniela. Microphone racing towards her as we speak. Daniela Serrett.
So publicly, just about everyone with a platform is against the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. However, privately, it seems that so many people are still sharing and distributing these images anyway. So how do we go about changing that culture? We'll
keep the microphone with you, Daniela. I'll go to Lindy first on this.
I mean, I don't know. People love to have sex and people love to flirt with each other, and you can't really change these sort of fundamental drives that people have, and when they combine with new technologies, this is what happens. And I think the most productive thing that we can do is keep hammering away at rape culture, at this sort of entitlement to women's bodies and women's privacy, at the demonization of female sexuality, and work on these sort of broader cultural changes, because I don't know how you can stop people from being horny. And maybe that's an oversimplification, but to me, the idea, like what needs change is the idea that there's anything that I could do to to force someone to commit a crime against me. You know what I mean? It's actually very insulting to men, as though men are just walking around like on the verge of raping someone or violating someone's privacy at all times. They just need to be triggered by the right outfit or the right sext. And so it's just, I really think that culture change on a bigger scale is the only productive surefire way to fix this problem.
I'm just going to quickly go back to our question. We kept the microphone with you, Daniela, because I know you work for the new e-safety commissioner. It's an office tasked with investigating cases of revenge porn. Why do you think that young women in particular, but also young men, are sharing these intimate photos knowing the risks involved, or do they just simply not know the risks involved?
You know, I think with social media being as big and as part of an everyday life as it is now, that young people, they just don't know any better because this is their way of living. You know, this is just instant gratification society. And so this is just a part of their everyday life. And I think that it's important to note that we shouldn't be putting the onus on, oh, you shouldn't have taken that photo, you shouldn't have worn those shorts, you shouldn't have done this. I think it's more of a discussion about the way of thinking that we have and how we pinpoint, why do I think that that's a bad thing? Why doesn't this woman be able to have empowerment over her body, or this man have empowerment over his body and not be judged for sending that? So I think part of what our office is doing is creating a tool where you can report these things online, but at the same time raising awareness that we don't really want to say that, you know, you are a victim and you are wrong for doing so. It's more like stepping into your power. If this is happening to you and this is something that you're not okay with, report it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to go to Faustina first, and then I'll come back to you, Lindy.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I like the headway that you're making with this, because I thought there were laws to kind of protect revenge porn. There aren't? Okay. Whoa. And this, you know, what really needs to change is a huge attitude shift towards how we treat our partners and people that we you know, adore sexually. And there is a serious issue with objectification of the people that I think that we date or spend time with and have sexual intimacy with.
do you accept the idea that that young people today think differently about this kind of sharing of these intimate images?
I think it's just unevolved and it's just not conscious, really, and kids are being really, really silly then, you know, and that's why there needs to be education. They need to know the greater consequences of that.
Lindy?
I just wanted to say, so I have teenage daughters, and it's pervasive at their school, this kind of, which is terrifying because they're children. But, you know, we also have to keep in mind the fact that girls especially are socialized to want to please boys and to want to make boys happy and to want boys to like them. And that's really, really toxic. And boys, meanwhile, are socialized to like try to, you know, get whatever they can out of girls. And they're often really manipulative. I hear these stories all the time from within my own family. It's really, I mean, luckily not within my own family, I hope. But, you know, about my daughter tells me about her friends and the trouble that they're getting into. And I also think, to the previous question, a really, really powerful thing that we can do is implement laws and very strict penalties for people who engage in this kind of in revenge porn, so that there are consequences. Because right now there aren't consequences.
Let's go to Josephine and ask about that. Consequences. Are there not enough? Should there be more?
Well, I'm not an expert in this field, but definitely we need laws to protect women and men as well, if it's used against them. But I think there is a good thing, and coming back to my point, there is a place for laws in our society. There is a place, I mean, people stopped drink driving. Drink driving was so common before people in Australia, but when you knew if you got high range, you're going to jail, high range drink driving, you're going to jail. Why can't we do the same sort of laws to protect women? Why don't we apply one-punch rules to when women get hit in domestic violence? What you know, and a lot of the intimate partner revenge porn really disturbs me. It's someone you've meant to love, and it's taking away the teenage folly. It's in between an intimate relationship, and it's a real breach of trust. And I've also seen cases where people do it to an extreme to actually affect their people's career. They can use it for blackmail. They can use it for inducement. So I have to say that's another thing the government probably should do, and is make sure that with their domestic violence legislation, I think we're going to have domestic violence legislation and regime. They also need to have move on with technology and make sure that there's general and specific deterrence, because just talking to people, the rubber hits the road when someone who does a really nasty offence and jeopardises someone goes to jail. The community know. We're not mucking around with this.
OK, we've got a couple of hands up in the audience here. We're going to go out with this question. So I'll just go to this lady over here who's got a hand up. But first, May, while we're getting the microphone over there, what do you think? Pretty scary world, particularly for young women who face this kind of thing.
Well, I have to confess, you know, maybe I had children 6 years ago, and maybe I took a little break or something, but when you said the word revenge porn, I was kind of mentally thinking, what is that? For a minute. And of course, after listening to the discussion, then I understood, oh yes, this is what it is. And yes, I feel that, you know, this is a big issue. We are very behind. Legislation has always been behind technology, you know, and I think on this field, we are like 3 steps behind. So
let's go to that questioner who just put a hand up.
My question is to the panel. We've got all these laws, rules, and regulations, but it stems coming back to is educating the children from young age so that they don't implement all these things that they are doing now. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you. That is such an excellent point. I'm happy to say that the Icelandic government has now implemented modules that make it so that digital sexual education is now part of the curriculum. Because as Lindy says, we live in a world with emergent technologies, and we're not going to stop using them. And when we're at that hormonal stage in our lives and we're taking our first steps into these realms of sex and love, it's all going to merge, and it's become a part of sexual behavior, which is why it's not enough to teach kids how to protect themselves in physical sex. We also need to teach them how to protect themselves in the digital sphere. That's extremely important. But to answer your question from earlier, when you're talking about how can we stop this sharing of explicit photos in relationships, I'm not sure if we should even be trying to stop that, because that is our right, our sexual expression within relationships. We're allowed to trust one another for these things. We're just not allowed to breach each other's trust when it comes to these things.
Is good in raising education as well, is to not call it revenge porn at the same time, because we're implying by saying revenge porn that it's some sort of activity that's looked frowned upon and looked down upon, and it has some sort of way of having both parties agreeing to it, whereas this is what we like to call it from our office is image-based abuse at the end of the day.
Right. Non-consensual, absolutely.
Now then, I'm so sorry, but we've just gone over time, so I'll take that final comment as a comment, and we'll have to leave the discussion there. It's been a fantastic discussion. It's been all about women. That's all we have time for, though, tonight. Please
there's
thank
a guy.
May Yes, a man did finally put his hand up. May Fong, Josephine Cashman, Lourdes Elva, Lindy West and Faustina Agoli. We'll get to you, sir, on our next All About Women show. Now, remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra. Join Tracy Holmes and her guest Van Badham on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live, taking talkback, I should say, and discussing your social media comments and questions as soon as we finish here. Now, next Monday on Q&A, a mix of politics and the arts when we broadcast live from the Adelaide Arts Festival with Canadian singer-songwriter Martha Wainwright, renowned theatre, opera and film director Neil Armfield is also co-director of the Adelaide Festival of Arts, media and arts executive Kim Williams, and actress and cabaret singer Ursula Jovic. Until next week, good night.
For information or support on issues raised in this program, please contact one of these services: 1-800-RESPECT, 1-800-737-732, Lifeline 13 11 14. Men's Line Australia, 1300 78 99 78.